building on some of the research from my book and otherwise, I'm going to be taking a view or taking a look at the future of higher ed credentials and really what the trends are if we look across this landscape in what I term the ecosystem. You really need to think about what are institutions doing, what are employers actually demanding, what are the patterns with individual students and what they're choosing to pursue. Because in a lot of the important dialogue that's happening, often you only see one view that's reflected. Maybe it's the Silicon Valley sort of technocrat view that says, okay, colleges and universities is going to be blown up and disrupted by these new technologies and these new startups, or employers and the claims that there's a skills gap, et cetera. So as brief, relatively speaking, as this talk will be, it's really to paint a picture of the overall landscape and what the trends are to spark some dialogue, to spark some further research, et cetera. I am privileged to be starting up a new center for the future of higher education and talent strategy at Northeastern University. If you don't know Northeastern, Northeastern is very unique in being a global experiential university. So a long heritage, 100+ years of engaging with employers and cooperative education programs, and also a world-class research university known for its global focus, its online programs, and now its excellence in research. And so I just wanted to point out that in addition to being a researcher, a lot of this perspective comes from being a practitioner in the world of professional education, adult learning, and online education. So I've had the opportunity to design many new degree programs and certificates and employer engagements, and also even campuses in places like Seattle and Toronto and Charlotte. And a lot of my research work was inspired by engaging with that community as an administrator at Northeastern, being out there in the world, having conversations, sitting across the table from employer after employer, small businesses, Fortune 50 companies, et cetera, and seeing these patterns and realizing that there's a lot of gaps in what we understand. And so that's the great work that I think many of us are all interested in. So this term credential, right? Credential is a noun, but you can also use credential as a verb. It's attracting a lot of attention in recent years. And I go back to the Spellings Commission report, which I think was issued in 2006. And credential was used in the first page of the summary findings of that report. And ever since, whether it was the National Governors Association, President Obama, the Gates Foundation, Lumina, and others, we've seen this idea of let's look at credentials, which is the job market role of degrees and certificates and other post-secondary awards, and acknowledging that so much of students and families and other stakeholders' interest in higher ed or post-secondary education has been driven by the desire for job market outcomes. We've really latched onto this term credential. And it means different things at times to different people and kind of gets thrown around. But it's a key moment when we think about what is that job market role of a degree, of a certificate, or of something else. What do you really need? And what does it mean? What does it communicate? What is embedded in there? And so that's part of what we'll be digging into. Looking big picture at some of the US Department of Education IPEDS data to get a sense for, well, what are the trends in the credentials, the formal credentials that accredited institutions in the United States of higher learning award each year. And you can see those patterns right here. So even though overall enrollment has been flattening out, if not declining a little bit, the last couple of years, because people actually enrolling and then completing is a bit of a lagging indicator, you can see we're at still an all-time peak in 2015 in terms of the credentials that are being awarded. And this is the market share for each, if you will. You'll hear a lot of business language here in my talk because that's a lot of my perspective and my training in addition to education. You can also see, if it wasn't obvious, the number of bachelor's degree awards is much greater than the number of associate degrees, master's degrees, et cetera. But what's been happening is all this emphasis has been on sub-baccalaureate credentials, in policy making in particular, and associate degrees. Community colleges, for-profit institutions are the two segments of higher ed that award the most of those. That really peaked in 2011 and 2012 and has been declining. Meanwhile, master's degrees have been undergoing a long-term boom that goes back into the 1990s, where it's subtle, but the number of master's degree awards has, I think, doubled over the last 20 years or so. And then, for example, a lot of talk about graduate certificates, right? That is a growth segment. Yet when you compare the number of formal graduate certificates awarded by accredited colleges and universities, you see it's a drop in the bucket. I think it's about 1% or certainly under 5% of all the total credentials that are issued. So some of the macro trends here, again, the bachelor's degree remains in demand. As much as we see, and we'll talk about, there are some problems and major issues with bachelor's degree, particularly around cost, et cetera, but it is an in-demand credential. You have these ones which could hold a lot of promise, sort of flattening out, a lot of growth in graduate education, including certificates. But then if you were to put non-institutional credentials in here too, which is very hard to measure, various certificates, certifications, and diplomas, and perhaps even badges and other things we'll discuss, you're looking at maybe $200 or $300 billion plus in revenue that institutions generate by offering these credentials compared to maybe a few $100 million that various new startup businesses are doing in the world of professional credentialing. And then if you look out across all of the job postings over the calendar year 2016, which we can now do with real-time labor market information tools like Burning Glass, which is a company based out of Boston that I've worked with quite a bit over the years, and this is a very simple data poll. This is looking back at the year 2016, 25 million job openings in the United States, and what was the requested level of educational credential attached to that job. And now, importantly, that's really what type of education was either preferred or required. So the totals add up to a little bit more than 100% because you can require a bachelor's, prefer a master's, or something of that sort. But what you see here is that more than half of the jobs were seeking a bachelor's degree, and then another 20% were calling for a graduate or professional degree. Very different from what we actually see in terms of attainment, right? About 11 or 12% of the US population holds a graduate degree or advanced degree. I think it's around 30% with a bachelor's. And yes, there's high school jobs, and we could debate and analyze, as many of us do, what level of education is required for what kind of occupation, what kind of return on investment might it get you. But you can see the balance is toward the bachelor's and above. And it does cut across industries. So these are the top employers in the year 2016 who are hiring for bachelor's level roles. It's General Dynamics, it's United Health, it's Amazon, it's finance with JP Morgan Chase. And so the the job market has been bifurcating, according to the economists that look at this, particularly David Auteur from MIT and many others, where the jobs that are looking for bachelor's and above, and particularly advanced levels of education, have been experiencing a boom. And then high school jobs, associate degree jobs, et cetera, have not experienced the same growth. And that is leading directly to a lot of the polarization that we see in our politics and a lot of the kind of conflict and issues around opportunity. Because you have people who have more education and can get access to education getting ahead, while in many cases other people are unfortunately falling behind. And that, of course, makes it one of the issues of our time. If you look at the 2016 presidential election here in the US, if you look at Brexit, how people voted and what their really belief system and feelings about globalization and everything else are divided directly along educational lines. I think 80% of people with a college degree voted to stay in the EU in the UK. 80% of people that did not go to college or university in the UK said, we want to leave, we want to become protectionists. So there's broader social implications. I know a number of sociologists and other experts are coming through as part of these talks. I'm an educator and a business person by training, but I'm personally inspired by this work because it's so critical to the future of the economic and sort of democratic standing and competitiveness, et cetera, of our nation and of the world. So that's a little bit of a detour, but that kind of frames what's happening in the job market. I started to talk about the growth in graduate degrees. And if we zoom in on a particular demographic cohort, and you could look, of course, at the whole population as well, one interesting piece of data, and this is relatively new, comes out of the census, is if you look at individuals in the workforce by age 30, by age 29 actually, what share of them have earned a graduate degree by age 29? Never mind what they might do in, say, their 30s or 40s with an MBA, an MPA, or whatever else they might pursue, a graduate certificate. It's now up to 9%. So this was a trend that was already taking off. Moving a couple tenths of a percentage point each year is actually pretty significant for tens of millions of people, or perhaps 10 million, I forget what the actual number is. But then to jump 1% in an entire year, and then if you go back to 1995, right, so 20 years or so, it was 4.5% by age 29. 1995, that kind of Gen X cohort, or well, they weren't out in the economy then, but the point is this has doubled in the last 20 years. So there's a lot of momentum, particularly for individuals who are younger or in the earlier stages of their career today, to enroll and earn a graduate degree or some kind of advanced credential, even by age 30. And if you look at the SERP surveys out of UCLA, 75%, and this has been fairly consistent over the years, but it's been ticking up, 75% of all entering freshmen in the United States report that they aspire to earn an advanced degree over the course of their studies. So between the job market and people's sort of desires and interests and how things are working culturally, there's a lot of pull toward advanced levels of education. And I sometimes talk about that as we are now in a post-baccalaureate world, and you can think of this in two senses. We're moving beyond the bachelor's degree as sort of the dominant credential and experimenting with new forms of credentials because there's this real need for lifelong learning and continuous educational attainment. And then another way to look at post-baccalaureate, of course, is the idea that, yeah, the economy is increasingly demanding education beyond the bachelor's degree, both in terms of formal credentials, but also various sorts of lifelong learning. And Matthew and I were talking about things like the sheepskin effect in economics, and various ways that we need more data and we need to study and understand what does the credential actually mean versus the work experience that someone has, et cetera. But what's happening is, by various measures, and I'm working on a big survey on this right now, but in the data we have available, employer preferences and requirements for the level of education for jobs are escalating. And a lot of the job creation is at that bachelor's and more advanced level and beyond. And so people need episodic experiences over the course of their career, and maybe they're going to now have 50-year plus careers, right? With the increase in lifespan, the movement to knowledge work, the ability to work online, all these major trends in society mean that we're going to be working longer and doing more work from more places and perhaps changing careers. I'm not personally a believer of the data that shows that people are going to have 10 careers by the time that they retire. Maybe you'll work for 10 employers, sure. But if you're going to change careers 2 or 3 times, or you're going to skill up and remain competitive, you're going to need lifelong learning and perhaps a credential that sort of rolls that up into a package. And thus, you get a lot of important emphasis on stacking credentials and credits and on portability. Because what the individual, what the worker, what the consumer needs and wants is something that can move with them from job to job. Employers, when you survey or talk to them or look at how they behave, they've always wanted whatever is, they're profit-oriented for the most part. They've wanted what's shortest, quickest, cheapest, and most focused on their particular skills in their industry or in their organization. But what the individual benefits from is, yes, getting that kind of training and that kind of professional development, but being able to move with it. And not even talking about stackable credentials, if you just look at credit transfer and how that works, especially for adults completing a degree or moving between community college and universities, we have major historical issues and challenges there, even within single states and single systems, much less the idea that I think is a fantastic one in which many groups are aspiring to build, that you will get some learning one place and maybe you do a MOOC or an online course or a college experience, something on the job at your employer, and you can somehow accumulate all that learning and credit and stack it into a credential that's awarded and certified by some body. So in many ways, that's the world we're trying to move toward, but we're far from it, unfortunately, given how things are working. And I think if you kind of back up and look at where we are today, there's a lot of important work being done in terms of more bite-sized learning opportunities and credentials that do roll up or stack toward a degree. Also in this mix, we have work-based credentials and industry credentials that are increasingly in focus. Another area where the data hasn't been very good historically, but these metrics actually come from a very recent survey that was published by the US Department of Ed based on some census data, I believe, in September. So this found that 27% of American adults hold a non-degree credential of some sort. Again, the word credential here does not mean just post-secondary institutional programs, but in this case, and you can have some overlaps, so these numbers add up to a little more than 27%, 18% have a professional license. Very often that's required, right, to work as a truck driver or a nurse or a financial advisor or whatever else. 6% hold some kind of certification, and then they've included in here in the questions a post-secondary certificate, which is a certificate awarded by a college or university, whether non-credit or for credit, and we'll get back into that dimension in a little bit. So again, if you think about it, okay, American population, 1 out of every 10 people has a university certificate of some sort, and that's up a little bit over years past. That's fairly interesting. 20% have a professional license. That's 1 out of every 5. And these non-degree credentials, these industry-based credentials, are increasingly intersecting with the formal programs. And there's questions about how they articulate and overlap, and are certain certificates and certifications required to get a job, and does that drive up costs like we see in some cases in healthcare? But in this whole story of credentialing, with the credential as this major character in how American higher education is evolving today, the discussion is really also about licenses, certifications, et cetera. And we'll discuss as we go a little bit more on some of the semantics. So we're in this moment with a lot of innovations and a lot of experiments and a lot of pilots of credentialing innovation and this big bang, right? So there's a lot of credentials that are being created, a lot of new constructs, a lot of new programs and experiments and semantics for what these credentials are. So the universe of credentials is expanding, and it's moving rapidly, and the big question is, as things start to kind of cool and slow down in this Big Bang analogy, where's the coalescence? Where's their critical mass and momentum around a set of credentials that has uptake in the job market or that employers begin to recognize? We're not there yet. We are in the Big Bang expansion phase right now, and it's early. But looking down the line, that's really what to watch for, and what we'll need to study as it happens is where are the things that get the critical mass and get the momentum, and I'll talk about a few of the early examples. And as a result of this Big Bang, and what's happening in the job market and the interests of policymakers, et cetera, as well as the search for alternative revenue streams, there's a great interest in alternative credentials. And that word alternative is key because it's so often framed around the degree is too long and too expensive. We need something else. We need an alternative to the degree. Maybe it's a boot camp. And I would point out that with some exceptions, all of the coding boot camps, which have been fairly successful, but they're undergoing kind of a consolidation phase in a fast-growing industry, none of them actually award a credential, again, with some exceptions. So you complete this experience, and you've graduated from a program that has a certain brand and relationships with employers, and you've gained skills, but you don't actually have a credential to reference on your resume or otherwise that's recognized. And yet boot camps get lumped into all the discussion about quote-unquote alternative credentials. Interestingly enough, it's actually one of the few areas that I'd argue that President Obama and President Trump sort of agreed on the policy and the general direction, is that, hey, we're trying to get more people into and through college, but we need to look at and encourage alternatives, whether it's apprenticeships or coding boot camps or online programs. The forces that drive higher ed are prioritizing the things that aren't degrees, but often intersect with degrees. So what do we have as some of the major categories? We have many new types of certificate. And I'd watch that word very closely if you're interested in this when you see it. When I work with employers, very often when I mention certificates, which is a post-secondary certificate, right? The completion of a series of courses and something you get from an institution, they often conflate that or confuse it with certifications. And they start talking about supply chain or project management or IT and how they value certifications. Within higher ed, perhaps even here at this university, indeed at most universities, As you move from department to department, college to college, you will not necessarily find consistency even within a single institution in what a certificate is. It might be 3 courses someplace, it might be 5 courses another place to get a graduate certificate. In addition to that, we have non-credit and for-credit certificates. I'll argue that non-credit, or rather that credit is mattering increasingly less as long as the credential is awarded by a university. And then we have the big question of what happens when the credentials come from outside parties. And so that term certificate is very interesting because we don't even have a standard today for something that's been with us for 100 years or so. Digital badges, a lot of interest, perhaps a little bit of a decline in momentum for badges, which were initially positioned as an alternative to degrees. The Chronicle of Higher Ed ran an article just a couple years ago that said that badges pose a challenge to traditional diplomas. We're not seeing any evidence of that. But what I think is happening is that a digital badge, the idea that you have kind of a micro-sized construct or signal of your learning or of your competency or of your skill, and that it can be shared digitally via social media or LinkedIn or sent to an employer and verified, that kind of functionality, if you will, is going to be woven into all credentials, all post-secondary credentials and degree awards. So I think we'll have people coming out of the University of Wisconsin and other institutions where they in effect have what today is a badge kind of functionality where an employer or any interested party can drill down in some kind of a simple online platform to see what competencies and courses someone has or completed. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden in 10 years or even in 3 years or 30 years that people are going to come to universities or go elsewhere and earn a bunch of badges rather than a degree, which is what many people, at least historically, have been talking about. Then we have, and you could say you might include badges under microcredentials, this whole class of microcredentials, where if you look closely, I've included the trademark logo there, because these are actually trademark terms. They are owned by the for-profit and non-profit startups that have created these constructs. Udacity with the nano degree, edX with the micromasters. So an institution that isn't working with that firm cannot offer a nano degree, cannot offer a micromasters. It's only for their partners. And that's also partly by design. To my point about the big bang and the critical mass that we might see, you know, what happens as you have more micromasters out there in the market? Does that begin to get recognized by employers as yes, something that's sort of like a graduate certificate but shorter, and it's not a master's degree from MIT, but it does mean something. So there's that whole class of credentials. Yet, when I'm speaking to giant groups of employers and just ask them to do a show of hands or other ways that you might measure this more formally, you find that employer awareness of microcredentials, and there's countless microcredentials, is still very low. So what microcredentials do appear to be doing today are working as a supplement. They're supplementing but not supplanting the degree. People are earning micromasters and nano degrees and badges and various certificate in addition to their bachelor's or in addition to their associate degree, or perhaps they only have a high school education. This is something that they get that's helping them less in initial job qualification, where the degree is very much still preferred, even if challenged a little bit over the long term. And this is something that we're seeing much more accepted by employers for promotion and a signal of professional development, rather than something that, you know, if you have it, it means you're going to qualify for a given job. And certainly when we begin to talk about regulated occupations and fields, you know, certain areas of public administration, nursing and healthcare, finance, you know, many of those areas, a degree is woven into the specifications for maintaining or achieving a license, teaching, et cetera. So it will be interesting to watch if we do see examples of, let's say, many of you are probably closer to this than I am, but I know one of the areas that is experimenting a lot with badging is K-12 education, right? Or micro-credentials in the classroom and in teacher ed, where you have these same incentives and interests around lifelong learning. As we saw with North Carolina and what happened there, and their sort of de-incentivizing earning a master's degree, et cetera. What would happen if a state says, you know what, it's not going to be a degree anymore Perhaps we'll have kind of a state-certified way that people could get micro-credentials instead, and that will qualify one for a job or for a salary increase or whatever else. So some of those examples are beginning to percolate, but right now we need to do a lot more to actually understand what's the employer-side demand for micro-credentials. I'm a fan and I'm a student of micro-credentials. I think there's a lot of potential there. Yet, in the public dialogue and discourse, a lot of what we see is claims that there is growing demand for microcredentials. There's certainly growing interest about microcredentials on the part of institutions, perhaps on the part of employers. If you look at the enrollments and the revenue being generated by edX and Coursera and the universities that are experimenting in these areas, yes, it's growing, but it's still a very, very small share of the overall US higher ed market. And so one way you can summarize or think about some of the momentum flows in this landscape is in this graphic that I pulled from my book, which is really just comparing credential length and depth along the y-axis here, going from long and broad, right, doctoral, bachelors, and so on. Those are programs that take a long time, but then as you move up toward more short and targeted, we're talking about certificates of completion. I actually forgot to point out when talking about certificates, consider also, and one of the major growth areas for certificates is a certificate that you might get from a university for completing an executive education program. So perhaps you do this at the business school over there, or maybe it's over that way based on where I'm standing. But you go to a one-week program or a weekend program and you get a certificate, and a certificate from the University of Wisconsin goes on the resume perhaps with the same terminology and thinking in terms of how an employer might perceive it as if you did a 5-course graduate certificate with assessment and an admissions process, et cetera. So I find that pretty interesting. So you have the length and depth of the credentials, and then out here, this is a traditional accredited institutions in blue, and then non-institutional providers in this pinkish color, right? So professional certification in say the IT field, new things like nano degrees, badges, which are the shortest form and most non-institutional thing you can get for the most part. These live out here, and what's happening is these different industry-based providers and credentials are increasingly partnering with universities and trying to move a little bit this way to get some of the credibility and the depth that comes from being affiliated with an institution. While meanwhile, the pressure and the trend and the opportunity for many universities is to unbundle their curriculum and to take these associate programs and sub-baccalaureate programs, master's and graduate programs, and to unbundle that curriculum and that IP and so on into modules and new kinds of certificates. And so they're all converging around here, where the institutions are trying to be shorter, more targeted, more affordable, more professionally and industry oriented, and these startup providers are increasingly partnering with universities so that it goes beyond just this kind of short, quick industry thing with no further recognition. And so this introduces a lot of new competition, but also a lot of convergence and opportunity as we see affiliations between non-institutional providers and traditional accredited institutions. The U.S. Department of Education's EQUIP experimental site initiative, which we're excited to be a part of at Northeastern, as one of the 8 programs that's involved, that was really about non-institutional providers like boot camps and MOOC firms, et cetera, and testing, might that be eligible for federal financial aid for Title IV? Can we measure the quality? Can we introduce new quality assurance entities into that? Well, EQUIP goes on. It was one of the last efforts of the Obama Education Department. What's had less notice, but is in exactly that same direction, is the recent GI Bill, which is, I think, one of the few things to get through Congress lately. That actually has a carve-out for non-institutional providers, where for the veterans funding, I don't know how to properly refer to it, non-institutional providers like boot camps are actually eligible for that money. And of course, that's pretty much a fixed pie. So as that happens, that means all of our institutions, whether this is happening federally or in states, are competing for those dollars with some of these upstart providers. What's also a way you could look at what's happening in credentialing is the historic, the higher education, college and university vertically integrated value chain, that the university owns all these functions and is the only one that does it, is starting to move toward a more horizontal model where you have different providers and different entities that are doing a little bit of each in today's online world. So this business concept of vertical integration, if you think about manufacturing an automobile, right? Back in the day, decades ago, and I'm not a manufacturing expert, but Ford and GM, when they manufactured a vehicle, they probably did the chassis and parts of the engine, perhaps different wheel components, electronics, whatever would go into the car. And over time, that became a competitive global market over many decades, right, where it moved to more of a best-of-breed system, where they're building the vehicle. Or if you look at the iPhone, right, it says designed by Apple in California, but it has parts sourced from all over the globe. That model moved to more horizontal integration. The same thing is beginning to happen with higher education. So knowledge creation, you can think about that as, and we've had, of course, publishing companies and firms and textbooks for a long time, and that's a whole domain that's, of course, been blown up, and we now have open educational resources, et cetera. Right? The university and the faculty create the knowledge, and they're doing the research. They then disseminate it through teaching. You can get a lot of that content today on YouTube or Khan Academy or Coursera, or broadcasts through your university or something else free and online. The university does the assessment, and the university is also the recognized credentialer. Right? So the research, the teaching, assessing that actual package of learning, and then issuing the credential. What's beginning to happen in this value chain is you have new providers coming in, and you have, as I mentioned and began to allude to, policy shifts, where perhaps you'll get a credential from a university or some kind of third-party agency, but you actually got the content and the teaching somewhere else. Or perhaps you do a test or a certification or some kind of assessment based on knowledge from a university or somewhere else. Perhaps we'll have third-party credentialers, like industry associations or like employers themselves. So that's just another construct to think about in terms of some of what's happening. Underlying all of this is shifting trends in educational delivery. Right? It's not all online education, but a lot of it has to do with online education and how that's become more accepted and more mature. So today in the United States, 1/3 of all graduate education is now done via online or hybrid delivery. It's students that are taking at least one online course, and many of them, about 1/4 of the total, fully online. That's kind of a very significant tipping point. I think it's about 25% of all US higher ed students are studying online or in some kind of blended modality. That's actually the preference when you survey, and this has long been the case, it's also been growing, for adult learners, is not necessarily fully online, but some type of online mixed with face-to-face. In fact, if you look for a couple of years at the IPEDS data, what you see if you break out, now that they've been doing this the last few years, if you dissect adult learner enrollment, right, let's just say students over age 25, by online and traditional face-to-face, the traditional face-to-face enrollment among adult learners has actually been shrinking. That face-to-face market has been in decline a bit each year, and the only area of adult learning that's been growing is online. And it's been driven in part by continued acceptance among employers, more so at the graduate level and for continuing education than for an initial degree, but certainly there's basically a commoditized bachelor's degree completion market online, a lot of competition on price, thousands of options, if not hundreds, for students today. And another big change we've seen, if not obvious, is top-ranked institutions in the mix. 6 years ago, you could not get a fully online degree from Columbia University, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, UNC, Chapel Hill, et cetera. You can today. So that's led to growing acceptance among employers, among other institutions, et cetera. So the dam's kind of broke in that regard. But it is now, because of all that supply, versus 20 years ago when David and I and others were working in some of the first online accredited programs, there's so many options. So it's a mature market with slowing growth. Therefore, while online is the growth segment of higher ed, it is not what it was just a couple of years ago, where you could just launch an online program and expect enrollment growth. Right? Oh, we're going to do an online MBA for our local population. Well, now there are hundreds of options, and it's a market that's slowing and maturing. There's also, as I alluded to earlier, just an explosion of competition in what we've classically talked about as non-credit due to this. So you can get these online courses and very high quality content in many cases from a variety of sources and from some of the best institutions in the world. So not only are universities competing in non-credit with libraries and associations and other groups, which they've done historically, but now it's all these new entities and all these other institutions, and a real challenge to the future revenue model for non-credit. And yet, as I talked about, that boom in lifelong learning makes that a very compelling and important area to have offerings. Finally, in terms of educational delivery, competency-based education, right? Very promising. And I often point out that employers themselves are still getting to competency-based hiring. And we need to map that to competency-based education. I think of competency-based education broadly as education that's going to lead to some specific outcomes and that you can really break down and articulate. Yes, often it's professionally oriented, but it needn't necessarily be. A lot of policy push and emphasis on CBE, very promising, but not a panacea. It's not enough to say, look, we're doing something online. Look, we have a version that's CBE. There's a lot more to the growth in this market. Colleges and universities themselves, as much as we've talked about non-institutional providers, are among the leaders in pioneering new, more modular credentials. And here are a handful of examples. University of New Haven partnered with Galvanize, which is a boot camp. It's one of those exceptions. And it's part of a trend. I think there's also General Assembly with Lynn University in Southern New Hampshire and other examples where you complete the coding boot camp, but then it also rolls or stacks into a master's degree from this institution. NYU's School of Professional Studies has had a lot of success totally rebuilding their historical certificate programs around basic and advanced and professional diplomas. So they introduced a new terminology and a new construct because they had seen that a lot of people in the job market were saying they had an NYU certificate, but it was non-credit, there wasn't any assessment, and the employers in the region really got confused. So they went back to the drawing board a bit and rebuilt things in 3 different tiers and mapped everything to job competencies. At Northeastern, we've developed something called the iCert. At Harvard Business School, they've had thousands of students complete the Credential of Readiness, I think generating more than $10 million in revenue for basically something that's a pre-MBA type of program and very short and focused, and what you get is called the Credential of Readiness. We've talked about the MicroMasters and some of the university certificates. Wisconsin Extension and a number of peer institutions are pioneering the University Learning Store, which is a very interesting effort with badging and certification and really short form bites of learning consistent with a lot of these trends. And then the area I think is maybe most interesting, a couple of these examples on the right, where you have a MOOC. And a MOOC is being combined with a traditional degree. So whether it's Southern New Hampshire's College for America, which is also on here, or the iMBA at the University of Illinois, what you get at the end is a traditional credential. You get an MBA. You get an associate degree. It is not a new credential construct. What a lot of the innovation is around is in how you earn the credential, online, CBE, experientially, etc. So beginning to wrap up here, so we have time for David to offer some ideas and also for some Q&A. The big trends in the landscape, and we've touched on these themes, some of them might be obvious, are, of course, we're going to have and need theoretical education, but toward practical and experiential, much more project-based, being able to demonstrate. Let's see, if you look at a lot of the MOOC certificate programs and new credentials that are out there, almost universally they include an applied project or a capstone. So it's not just what you learn, but then also demonstrating what you can do, especially in segments like the technology industry. From traditional to online, from monolithic to short form, and also, interestingly enough, from instructor-led to more self-paced and from static to adaptive. So the use of AI and technology and algorithms in some of these online programs. Georgia Tech ran an experiment where they had a teaching assistant that was actually an AI, and the students did not notice. I think it was running with IBM Watson. And they called the TA Jill Watson. At the end of the course, it was revealed that it was actually artificial intelligence that was serving the TA role. The instructor role in a lot of these MOOCs, a lot on the front end, on the design and the content design and the curriculum design, but then there's a lot of machine learning that's actually helping deliver the course and grade the courses. So as much as we're importantly talking about how is automation going to impact the economy at large, we also need to closely look at how is automation and AI impacting the role of faculty labor and faculty expertise, because there's both opportunity there, but then there's also some risk. And these models, a lot of these innovative credential models, what we see in these examples are right off of the Udacity website and the Capella University website, one of their investor presentations. You can begin to think about this as a spectrum, where you have the MOOC version that's low cost and free, and then maybe in something like the IMBA, you're getting more faculty interaction, more access to peers, more services. It's a higher price point, but it's not quite the same as the full-time on-campus program or the executive version. And so there's a tiering of what's happening where you're substituting out these types of dimensions, the admissions, the support, the content, the assessment, the tuition, from free to $10,000 to $60,000, the pace, the learning resources. Things are shifting along those dimensions. And to use a business and branding analogy, I sometimes think about this as what you see with some of these major brands and businesses, right? The MOOC might be the Scion or Old Navy version. The mass market version that most people are going to buy or need is your Toyota or your Gap. And then maybe the full-time intensive instructor interaction, higher priced offering is your Lexus or your Banana Republic in this new world. And of course, there's a lot wrapped up in there to think about. We're also seeing, I think this is one of my last slides, new pricing models and entirely new pricing dynamics and transparency and ROI calculus for the consumer. So Udacity and others that are in the non-institutional, non-accredited space are hanging their hat sometimes on guarantees, money-back guarantees. If you pay us $2,500 for our nano degree, we guarantee we will place you into a job. This is a snapshot from the University of Kansas website comparing their tuition rates and some price competition online with some other institutions. In this world of Yelp and the College Scorecard and LinkedIn and Google, right, pricing information and now outcomes information increasingly. Did graduates get hired? Can I see on LinkedIn, did they advance in their job after they completed this credential? That's becoming more transparent, and there's not going to be anywhere for institutions to hide if they have a poor quality program. And then things like the University Learning Store, where for a very modest cost, you can get access to a module, to a learning app, or to a badge assessment beyond the fact that you could do a more formal certificate. And finally, as I alluded to earlier, we also have some employers that are emerging as credentialers in their own right. The IBM badging program, we actually announced just a couple weeks ago that at Northeastern we're articulating, we deeply assessed their badge content and curriculum and process, and we're articulating that for credit into a number of our master's programs, just a handful where we did the one-to-one mapping. So you have certain employers who are saying, look, we want to be known as the brand that is best associated with the cloud or the Internet of Things, and Cisco as another example. And they're beginning to offer their own credentials and their own badges that will both intersect with and compete with what colleges and universities are offering, especially in a world where you can curate and document credentials in various ways. That's the big kind of startup boom area within EdTech, is the Degrees and the Credleys of the world and Parchment, all these businesses that are actually organizing themselves around the digital documentation and transfer of credentials. Many of them, and we'll see what happens with Microsoft and LinkedIn and some of these big firms with billions and billions of dollars, but they really own a lot of the data on people's professional success, and they have the big data to be able to compare what credentials do they have to what was their success in the job market. So with that, I will pause. I think we'll transition to David, and we're hoping with this to prompt some Q&A and some dialogue as we continue.
I think the context here for why this rapid increase in alternative credentialing that Sean was talking about is really important. And one of the main reasons is that traditional higher education is hitting the market limits of what's possible. Right, so public funding, we know this all too well from Wisconsin, is flat and declining in most states and is not coming back. The outcomes issue that Sean talked about is real, and there has been a real call for increased evidence of outcomes across the higher education sector. Tuition is at a market ceiling. I remember when I was at Illinois in the late 90s and early 2000s, we were jacking up tuition. And our chancellor and our provost used to say, we want to stay in the middle of the pack. Of course, the entire pack kept going up and up, so we could significantly increase tuition. And we were increasing tuition sometimes double digits per year. So those days are done. The market is not going to tolerate that. So the one other thing, and then I'll move on here, the one other thing that I think is really, really important is the regulatory space. The regulatory space has kept higher education from significantly changing for a long time, and that regulatory space is starting to show some fractures. We'll see how much that's going to change, but certainly, for instance, the credit hour and what a credit means has been regulated and protected for a very long time. So you've seen the statistics. I'll run through this very quickly. We know, for instance, that college debt is very high. That's part of the reason why we simply can't keep increasing tuition rates. What students these days want from their college education is not out to party and it's not to have fun, it's to get a good job when they're done. That's the main thing that they want. Most students today, college students, are non-traditional by our former standards. Many of them are working, they come in and out of school, they have lives that are that extend far beyond the college campus, and they experiment in ways with their lives for much longer periods of time. So whereas it used to be that you'd think the 18 to 22-year-old time frame was the time for experimentation, and then you get serious and you get a job and you get married and you move on with life, nowadays the experimentation phase goes through the early 30s. So that prolongs the time when people come in and out of education. One thing that is useful, I think, as a data point when we talk about alternative credentialing is the relationship between higher education and the rest of the economy, especially for those of us who are in adult or continuing or professional education. We know that the economy and higher ed work countercyclically when it comes to degrees. So, for instance, when there's a recession, more people go to school because they're not working and they want to improve their chances for employment down the line. But when the economy is good, enrollments tend to drop in traditional programs, but employers are willing to pay for training. So that's when alternative or micro-credentialing can become very lucrative. So just on this graph here, I tried to line these up roughly year-wise, but you see that there's this spike or little increase in the number of students in college, and you see that more or less that coincides with the recession and unemployment on that top graph, and as unemployment goes down, enrollments tend to decline as well. And for those of us who are in the business of developing various kinds of academic programs, this counter-cyclical process is really important. And so when the economy is good, employers do spend on training, and fewer are investing in their own training operations. They're outsourcing. So the days in the 90s and the early 2000s when universities were setting up corporate universities, those days are done. Now a lot of employers don't want to pay for that infrastructure or invest long-term in the staff, because one of the first things that goes when the economy goes south is training investments. So they don't want that long-term investment, so they'll outsource it. But main point here, $70.6 billion invested in 2015 for training. So huge, huge market. I like this slide because it builds exactly on what Sean was saying, but in a slightly different way. So yes, degrees are critically important, but look at what's happened if you have a bachelor's degree or less, right? So what this slide shows you is median household income comparing 1991 to 2014 in 2014 dollars. So if you have less than a bachelor's degree, median household income has decreased. If you have a bachelor's degree, you're treading water. And if you have a master's degree, the margin is the greatest out of all the other margins, right? So if you have a terminal degree, you're doing well, and your margin is a little bit better. But the margin on the master's degree is by far greatest out of all the degree options. And I think it's important that we pay real attention to basic demographics. And so I'm not going to go through a bunch of this stuff. But I do want to highlight this in red here, because we are seeing this happen in Wisconsin now. And we are seeing this play out not just globally, but in this country. And that is that the country is aging. And the number of people who are going to be available to stay in the workforce is decreasing relative to the number of people who are going to depend on the people in the workforce for healthcare and services and the like. And so as lifetimes get longer, and as people live longer and longer, the opportunity to continually come in and out of college is really important, and that's why these micro-credentials really matter. So what's the result for those of us who are engaged in programming? These are some of the key areas where programming is really going to be important, and it already is, as we know: healthcare, technology, distributive justice, and so on. What's interesting about these areas is that they also lend themselves really nicely to professional credentialing or micro-credentialing and so on. There's already a lot of stuff here, and these are likely to be the sectors around which there could be some coalescing of alternative credentialing. Right now, alternative credentialing is just a mess. There's no standard, really. There are a few in the technology area, a few in the professional healthcare area, but for the most part, there's no real standard. These are real areas where you can see some coalescing. And then finally, the other area where we have not really done much with alternative credentialing, but where there's a huge need, is in foundational skills. We talk about these as gen ed skills, and students are supposed to get these. Usually, faith-based learning, you kind of go to classes and you're going to pick these up hopefully along the way. But focusing on these is going to be increasingly more important. And when we talk to employers tell us this is what we want from every single employee, entry level to senior person. This is what we need. And yet we don't focus on these outcomes, on these competencies. We focus on things like, anthropology 101 or sociology or English, but we don't focus specifically on teaching students this stuff. We hope that they pick it up. And so micro-credentialing here is going to be very challenging, but this is an area where micro-credentialing is going to be really important.
I'm wondering, is there another index that might be worth measuring, and that would be what percentage of students are in programs where the employer is paying the tuition? Because I know that's common, at least for some, primarily executives and others, but is that a statistic that would be worth looking into?
That is an area that's unfortunately and surprisingly been in decline a little bit. The Society for Human Resource Management and other groups that track HR benefits, for instance, they have a lot of surveys that have looked at this longitudinally. And I think it's dropped from maybe 55% of employers to today maybe 45% of employers have a formal tuition assistance program. And one of the interesting things is in the corporate world, that benefit, just like childcare or a 401k, is traditionally viewed as just a benefit, and it's managed by the kind of HR back office. Mm-hmm. Come work for us, or presumably here at the university as a shining example, right? You probably get all kinds of access to education. Seen as a benefit, it's not, or no, I guess not not necessarily here, bad example. Certainly that's the case at many private institutions. But that's not tied to corporate training. and it's not tied to your professional development plan or your advancement in the company. So there's always been a historical disconnect between tuition assistance benefits and actual skilling up and internal professional development. And then more to your question, it's actually been declining a bit because some employers cut back after the recession, but the risk, like in so many other areas, is being shifted onto the employee. And so I've been surprised by it because you see David's stats on companies investing more in training. There's a war for talent by many measures, unemployment at a historical low, and yet, there's not more of this tuition assistance. And then in certain segments of the economy, if you look at the associate level and high school level jobs and fields, especially the service industry, just in the last year or couple of years, Pizza Hut, McDonald's recently, Arizona State and Starbucks famously about a year ago, Walmart and American Public University a number of years back. Many of those employers that recognize that they're working with people where that's not going to be really a career or a professional or knowledge level job and that they are going to move on, they're now competing and offering these education benefits to get people to stay longer and then sort of move up and leave. So we have major issues to address kind of as a society, including, for example, the tax code hasn't changed in many years in terms of the amount, even with inflation, that an employer or an individual can get in tuition assistance and have it be tax-free. Whole set of interesting dynamics there.
For many employers, it's a retention strategy. That is really what they use it for. And we've talked to a number of employers. Recently, a company, we were trying to get into a deal like the Starbucks relationship with Arizona State. And for that company, it was all about keeping employees, entry-level employees who otherwise stay 3 to 6 months and they leave. It's very costly to keep repeating that process, of course, and so if you can get somebody to stay for a couple of years, you save a lot of money, and the amount that you spend on the education is relatively very small compared to what it costs to keep recruiting and retraining new employees.
I'm a sociologist that studies digital badging, and something that's been puzzling me for several years, because I study it more on the provider side and the discourse around it, is how employers think about credentials, whether it's old credentials or new credentials. I've looked at surveys of what employers say they want, but they're from the 2009 to 2012 period, and it all looks like they want general, the kinds of things we say are developed cognitively here. Then, as you pointed out, there's these 21st century skills that they say they want now. On the other hand, I read employers more and more want specific skills, very specific, and that can be badged granularly. There's talk of markets in competencies, not just badges. So I'd like to know from both of you, how do employers talk about what they're seeking from credentials? How do they decide what level of credential to set? How do they decide if they're going to be interested and demand badges? This is an area I'm completely cut off from.
My doctoral work focused in large part on how employers perceive and use credentials, and everything I've seen since as well. Their understanding and their process is much less mature than we in higher ed believe. It's messy, it's inconsistent, you can't really measure, they can't measure in their own workforce. How do people perform? Now they pay more, and there's a lot of other evidence to suggest there really is a value add there and a higher level of understanding, but they can't often measure a bachelor's degree worker versus a master's degree worker, all other things being equal, but they're beginning to do so with some of the new talent analytics and gathering of data that's happening. But how they actually set credentials, credential requirements and qualifications, outside of needing to be sure that they don't foul up any kind of regulatory issues with equal opportunity law, et cetera, is very underdeveloped. And so I think, and then particularly, so if you extend that, okay, well, what's it mean and how do we navigate all this? a lot of the surveys on what do employers want and so on, they're not always asking the people on the ground. And I know Matthew's work with the NSF and other work, that's getting on the ground and talking to the employers who are making the decisions and who are on the front line. The other thing is the hiring process and the credential setting the educational qualifications or even the experience qualifications is distributed, right? And there's no one sort of brain in a given company that's consistent that is working across all the jobs. I think that'll change slowly, but it is actually very messy.
Does the availability of alternative credentials down to the level of competencies at all feed into or shape how employers think? That is, they may change how they think because there's new patterns of credentials.
Now that we're beginning to have, let's call it digital credentialing, and the ability to click, drill down, have many portfolios, have ties to competencies, and have that represented and accessible in many of these different, whether you're graduating with a bachelor's from Arizona State, and you can do that through a system, or in the case of badging and other initiatives, I think that will begin to change what employers seek and how some of these dynamics work, but we're just not there yet.
Yeah, so I can give you a couple of examples. One example, a couple of years ago, I was up in the Fox Valley region talking to employers. And as many of you know, the Fox Valley region is heavily industrial based and so on. And so we wanted to learn how we can best serve those employers. And so we were talking to them about credentials, and many of them don't require a college degree, so we were trying to get a sense of their level of interest in alternative credentials. And we said, well, what do you guys think of badges? Are those valuable to you? And there was this complete blank looks across the room saying, well, what are those? So then we said, well, what do you think about certificates? And they're like, oh yeah, those are good. And when we probed a little bit, they had no idea what certificates are. They just heard of them. And then same thing about competencies. Do you guys, are competencies important to you? Well, what they heard is being competent important to you? And that, of course, the answer to that is yes. But when it comes to converting that into credentialing language, it didn't translate. And we talked to employers for our master's degrees, same type of conversation, higher level, but similar answers. And what was interesting, I think, in the conversations with both employers is that those sort of foundational or soft skills or power skills, whatever you want to call them, that I had on the board, those are really important to everybody. So for the entry-level employers, they say, we want people to show up on time. We want them to be honest. We want them to be able to talk to one another. When you talk to the master's level folks, it's about, we want them to know how to find the right question and then seek a path toward finding an answer. It's about critical reasoning and being able to talk to have the techie be able to talk to the CEO and at the same time talk to the sales guy so we can figure out what product to buy, right? It's really basic stuff, but they're not getting it.
In other countries, including Great Britain and and Australia, there have been massive, let's say, exposés of fraud, paper mills, all of these ways that people can toy with their identities or just buy, ghost-written documents and all of that to get through some of these programs. We have only had a few little uprising, little scares here, but what might happen if a few exposés might show that not all of these badges are what they say they are, assigned appropriately to individuals. Perhaps somebody's cousin or nephew or something like that is taking the exams, etc. What do you think are the best ways of solving these issues? Are there some technological firms, for example, ProctorU, who are doing it right?
I know that's certainly, that's one of the major business cases, if you will, for the credential documentation startups. There's one called Accreditrust based in New York or New Jersey. There's Parchment in Arizona. There's a number of firms where part of what they're saying to traditional accredited higher ed institutions, among others, like some of them they work also with the state, right, with the Department of Motor Vehicles for your license, is saying, okay, well, by issuing a digital credential, it's secure and verifiable. Now, it's theoretically secure, right? Because we thought our credit scores were secure with Equifax, and we thought our credit card data was secure with Target, and then it turned out it wasn't, to your point. So as this all gets stored in the cloud, and nothing against those particular firms, but there's the broader issue of data and information security. But I think part of the promise of these technologies, and even those technologies aside, there's a group called Learning Machine that's doing some work affiliated with MIT, where there's been a lot of talk about the blockchain, which is the technology that underlies the Bitcoin, and it's all a transparent public ledger. I think that's really a very kind of technology-oriented solution, but there are groups that are kind of experimenting with how do we make these credentials more secure, more verifiable, more transparent. And theoretically this world, but I think that's it's not necessarily transformative, it's a functionality that should theoretically be a part of every credential that's issued, versus right now I can go claim a certificate from a university and maybe it's not verified. I could claim a degree from a university. When I talk with HR leaders about that, when I was doing research for my book, most of them reported to me, we have major firms we work with for credential verification. We do not see it as a challenge in our own business. That gets built into part of the hiring process.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think there's different ways to answer your concern. One is there really a problem? Are people really cheating as much as we worry that they're cheating? Our experience is that they're not. It's sort of annoying in the classroom. Faculty get a bit annoyed about plagiarism and that kind of stuff, and okay, we get that. But we don't have, one person taking a bunch of tests on behalf of 500 people who are paying them in China, right? That's just not happening. The other thing is that you can solve the problem, for the most part, on the design of the assessments rather than the verification of the student. And that does two things for you. One is that it provides you with a much better assessment, and it gives you some actual confidence that the students really learned something.
In my experience dealing with HR folks, they kind of sheepishly admitted that the reason why they require a 4-year college degree is because it's a filtering process. And that's all that it serves. Otherwise, they have 10,000 applicants versus 100. And so the issue of competencies is a very different issue for them, and it scares them because they don't have any vehicle to address that at this time. It's literally on-the-job training, and that's why the probation period exists in their conversations with me. And so does that match up with your experiences?
Some of the promise of these new credentials, or of competency-based education or badging, some of the promise is that, okay, this is shorter, cheaper, more targeted, and rather than the degree being an expensive and monolithic signal or screen, we're going to be able to look very specifically, and people can get these things and employers can sort based on these things. At the same time, I just personally believe, not that it's the ideal situation, but when you dig in and ask employers why they use degrees as screening mechanisms, aside from all the skills that we assume are embedded in it, and they are paying premiums, so there has to be some economic kind of output benefit to it for the most part, it does signify something to them in terms of perseverance and ability to complete. It represents a curriculum. There's an acculturation process if you've been through a traditional college experience in many cases. This comes up with master's degrees. There's a little bit of a subtle problem in the market versus how it worked in years past. Historically, the master's degree happen to be associated with people who are older, right? I showed the data on people under age 30 getting a graduate level credential. Historically, you might come out of an MBA program, right, which is the largest single segment, the most popular master's alongside a master's in education, at age 32, 34. And so when employers then recruited from MBA programs or set as a job qualification and said, we want to hire an MBA for this task, they knew they were getting someone with maybe 10 years, 5 years of work experience. Now that you've had the average age in an MBA program decline to something like 27 or 29, that's less the case. And so how do you unpack that? What does the degree actually stand for versus the years of work experience? And I think, again, for employers, they find it very hard to decouple that. We need more data on it. And it also just struck me as a remark, because I know so many people are interested in the research, that already we have great examples of how this is a really critical interdisciplinary problem, right? It's technology, sociology, education, policy, labor market economics. And in each of these domains, there's, the literature doesn't tackle it directly most of the time, or maybe some scholars did many years ago, because you really have to integrate all these different dynamics. And so I don't know, that's a thought on that question.
Well, I think what Sean said is really important. It really depends on what you think the degree signifies. So if you believe that the degree, especially say a bachelor's degree, if that signifies disciplinary knowledge, you will inherently be disappointed. If you think that it signifies the ability to stick to a task and acculturation and a level of maturity, then it's actually a fairly decent indicator. And so it really depends on how you're interpreting it.
The Madison Area College over here, their average incoming students are 27 years old or 28 thereabouts with a 4-year degree. That's their incoming class because they can't find a job after they've got their 4-year degree. So, do you have any comments or thoughts about that kind of it? Or do you see that kind of thing happening in your work as well?
To some extent, I think we do see that nationally. I don't know if it's people who are struggling for work as much or going into a vocational program. But if you look at the coding boot camps, right, and I think they graduated something like 20,000 students, or maybe it's up to 40 or 60. I know that's wildly different numbers, but it's substantial. Can't remember off the top of my head. 80% of those people already hold a bachelor's, right, at all the coding boot camps and related analytics boot camps and skills kind of programs. Essentially, they're schools, and one of them, Flatiron School, was in the news, settlement with the AG in New York, as yet another example of this, where you've had this startup industry, and I mean, what do? They have space, they have instructors, they're promising job outcomes, they're teaching. They're basically kind of like an institution, they're just not an accredited institution. But the people that are coming to them, they might have a bachelor's in something that they're not using, and so then they're going sort of back to school, but they're choosing, in this case, an accelerated program, a low-cost program that has some kind of a job promise attached. It's certainly the case in a lot of master's education, where, of course, the bachelor's is a prerequisite, and then even MOOCs, 80% of MOOC participants, perhaps it's down to 75% across millions and millions of people, already hold a bachelor's. It's not transforming the lives of people in Africa and Southeast Asia as it was positioned. Now, of course, it is somewhat, but it's not like let's educate the world. It's people that already have a bachelor's are trying to skill up and qualify for their next job. And in Canada, that's also fairly common, where people come out of great institutions like McGill, the University of Toronto. This is coming from my work with employers in the Toronto area when we created a campus there. And then they go to their colleges, their community colleges in essence, and they get a certificate in marketing or a certificate in IT because they have certificates and diplomas that are pretty short form. And you get that case where someone has their foundation, a bachelor's, a general education, and then they need more. They need something more specific perhaps in certain cases. Now that's added cost, that's added time, and it reminds me of another point, which is I think obviously it's a very significant challenge, but I think there's so much we could do with improving the credentials we have, right? The bachelor's degree, and I think University of Wisconsin was one of the creators of the AAU. The AAU itself, I believe, came together to standardize the doctoral degrees as more American institutions started doing research and offering them in the German model. So you had institutions come together and say, we're going to have a standard, and we're going to align that. North Central accreditation, maybe around 1913, similar situation. University of Chicago was creating or sort of spinning off with Joliet College some of the first community college degrees, and the universities were only going to focus on the upper level 2 years, and you're going to do the rest at the community college. They said, we need a standard. It's going to be 120 credits or whatever. And the institutions kind of set that framework. Well, in this age where we have all these competing dynamics and these cost issues and these student debt issues and outcomes concerns, we're still continuing with really the same model that we've had. And it would be really interesting to explore, can we break down the bachelor's degree? And maybe that's some of the forces that are driving these market developments in this discussion, but they're happening in a more polarized way where you have like one side way over here wants to tear down everything, and then you have the status quo over here.
Where are conversations happening around the standardization of alternative credentials, right? You mentioned in your presentation, and David, I believe you did as well, that you ask employers what a certificate means and they don't have an answer. Do we have an answer? Do we actually know what that means? And have we set a standard? And if not, what do you see the process of that being as we move forward?
The Department of Education tried to create some standards for credit-bearing certificates based on which ones are eligible for federal financial aid. Those are, they're long and cumbersome and don't represent the majority of what's out there. The Lumina Foundation is trying to create a credentialing framework that would use competencies as the common denominator across all credentials and allow individuals to demonstrate kind of what they know by registering their credentials through competencies. That's a long way from completion, and so the best we've got right now for a common currency is the credit hour. And of course, as we all know, the credit hour is a measure of time spent on task and not a measure of actual learning.
Yeah, so there's initiatives like those from Lumina, Credential Engine, the Credential Registry, Connecting Credentials. But that's just a part of, a lot of it will happen, I think, at the state level, perhaps the federal level, and as I just mentioned, at least historically, associations and kind of voluntary groups of institutions that come together. In a micro way, it's happening with the MicroMasters at edX. So edX has expanded. I don't know how many partners they have, maybe 20, 30, for the most part, very well-branded research universities. 10 or 20 of them are offering the MicroMasters, and they've trademarked it, and they're going to really have some consistency across what a MicroMasters is and means and what you get out of it. And then perhaps they open it up, as they said was their goal in creating this new construct, and then other institutions could kind of adopt it. And okay, if we want to offer a MicroMasters, it has to entail X, Y, and Z. It reminds me a little bit of the Sloan Foundation, the Council of Graduate Schools, and I think one other group many years ago had the Professional Science Masters Initiative, PSMs. Perhaps you have some here. And they prescribed a framework and they put some funding behind it, maybe $10 million plus, perhaps. I don't recall exactly. For institutions to begin to offer professional science masters, where you need to have an advisory board, you need to have an experiential component, you need to have a certain mix between general courses and specialized courses, and they kind of laid that all out as a model, and it got adapted and it gained some momentum as a framework. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Again, in my view, the ecosystem is extremely large and diverse and complicated, 4,000 plus degree granting institutions, 50 states and more territories, the federal government, changing dynamics everywhere, the world of employers, there's thousands of them. And so it is partly about how can we activate some groups to kind of study this and create some frameworks and just speak the same language, right? For higher ed to speak the same language as employers. Just even taking that step and being able to, it seems like folks in this room might have comfort with it, but just that higher ed could be more responsive to the needs of employers in some general ways at least, and map professional competencies to broader ways of liberal learning. that on its own is still a struggle in the U.S. and around the world with sort of the ivory tower culture in some places.